Why create a mind map? Well, the first reason I believe is important to create a mind map is because it visually organizes content. Now, many people are visual, and they find that having a visual presented first before the narrative helps add value. It helps them to learn more. It also allows them to go from the narrative back to the picture and go back and forth between the narrative and the picture to gain a better understanding of what you're presenting. So as we look at writing a dissertation, we often look at the short view of who is going to review your work soonest. For you, that may be your dissertation chair. It may be your dissertation committee. It may also be the university staff who are going to review your work and possibly approve it or possibly not approve it. The idea which I would like you to think about is the long term. Think about 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years. As people read your work then, how can you help them easier understand what you're putting together? Oftentimes you can put yourself in the place of your reading audience by looking at other dissertations and finding those that resonate well with you. Are those the ones that have tables and figures in there that add value? Are those the ones that perhaps have a timeline, like was discussed earlier in one of the lessons in Chapter 2 about creating a timeline to add value as well as to add to the level of organization of your work? Additionally, so you might know that oftentimes a mind map may be considered a concept map. If you were to do a search of the internet and look for a mind map and concept map, you would probably find a lot of the same similar information. You would also find some that's a little bit different. Many people call what they're working on a mind map when in fact it may be a concept map, and vice versa. The important point here is as you're working with your Chapter 2, you may be dealing more with concepts and see that as you put your map together that it's actually more of a representation of concepts than the true definition of a mind map, which just provides that visually orientated work of the content. Again, some of them are simple and some of them are similar. So how you decide to put your work together may just vary. And in many cases, it's different terminology based on what university you might be at, perhaps what country you're in, what program you're working in. Oftentimes, it's much like how we look at qualitative research. One might call it theoretical saturation, where somebody else calls it data saturation. That means the same thing, really, in the sense of when you can stop collecting data through interviews because you've already reached a certain point where there's no new information. Both theoretical saturation and data saturation are basically the exact same thing, but some people call it one while some people call it another. Unfortunately, as you know, as you go through your dissertation work, not everything is exact and as specific as you'd like it to be. Oftentimes it's subjective, and that causes more problems than we would like to have happen for us from time to time. Another reason why you should create a mind map, because it adds value. Again, some people are visual readers. Adding value is something you should look at on a regular basis whenever you're doing any work in any chapter, as to say, how could you add value to the reader? How could somebody else get more from what you're writing than they might get otherwise? And this mind map or the concept map might just be one way. But I also believe, even if you don't include it in your work, by going through the process of creating this map, that it will add value to your work because you will see it differently. And more than likely, you're going to have a greater level of breadth and depth in your writing because you use the map to guide you. If you will, oftentimes a map is done before an outline. And I've talked with students and I've seen their work, and I've looked at people who have created the outline without a map and those who have used a map in addition to a timeline, and their work ends up being much more richer. Oftentimes, a map will help you to see what you have yet to be able to see. By putting a map together, you start to play, if you will. You start to create. You start to become innovative. You start to think beyond the scope of where your pen or your typewriter or your computer can take you by a keyboard. Oftentimes, when you start making circles by creating these nodes, if you will, on a map, as you start to see one, you start to see where another one that's related can be included. And then that adds another opportunity for you to yet see even more. Oftentimes there's this metaphor of a snowball going downhill because it picks up speed and it gets bigger and bigger. The same thing here happens, if you will, with your work. As you start to go downhill and things get easier, the more you add to it, the bigger it becomes and the more robust your work becomes. And then you truly develop that chapter 2 with a robust review of all the related literature. How to present the mind map? Well, first off, maybe you won't, because oftentimes, as I mentioned, one might do a map but not include it into the chapter work. That's okay. Some dissertation chairs, some dissertation committee members don't like to see a map because it's not required. That doesn't mean you can't put one in. If you believe it adds value to your work, I encourage you to put one in as long as it meets certain criteria. And I'll share some insights on what that criteria will be in a moment as I go through a couple more slides here. But the most important thing I believe is use that mind map to guide and organize your work early on, to be creative and see it come together first in a pictorial form, if you will, and then later into a narrative form. If you're going to include a mind map, I encourage you to have no more than one page per map. Now, if you're going to do a mind map of, let's say, a quantitative dissertation where you have one dependent and 3 independent variables, putting that map up with just that information may be fine. But if you start filling out more information about all the different variations or interrelationships that deal with each of the dependent and independent variables, you might find that the map becomes a bit confusing or a bit perhaps cluttered. You have to remember, when you publish your dissertation, you can only fit so much on a page. And if your map is too complex and somebody who then reads your work can't read what each individual word is on your map, then perhaps the map is not going to serve you well. But there is another option, that perhaps you have more than one map if it's needed. In the example of the quantitative study where you have one dependent variable and you have 3 independent variables, then there you might have one map for just the dependent variable. And then you start to include the different relationships to other points of value about that dependent variable. And then as you write your narrative, then when you address each individual independent variable, then you might have another map. Or you might have one map that then shows them all together in a way that's still readable. This is going to be up to you to decide whether you put this map in or not and how it's going to look. Remember, you may create a really good graph in a computer that when it's on your computer screen or blown up, it looks great. But by the time you condense it down and put it into a page, into a dissertation in your perhaps MS Word document, it may be too small. And then therefore people can't read it. So there's no sense putting in a figure such as a map if people can't read it. That will detract from the value of your work, not add to it. As you look to present your map, make sure that the map is presented around ideas, not sources. If you're doing that quantitative study around a dependent and independent variables, those are the ideas. Those are not the sources or the references that you have. Oftentimes I see people taking the references they have and they start to include them by perhaps a subject or a topic that they have on their map. What you want to look for more so in that case is the keywords that could be included in the map that allowed you to find the citation or that reference, the references that you're going to use. But don't put your mind map or write chapter 2 around references. The idea is that you have read all the literature and you have done some reviews and you have offered a comparison and contrast and then taken it to a synthesis and then an analysis and evaluation of that synthesis. And then you're just supporting your ideas and concepts with the sources. And it's not about how many references and quotes and paraphrases you have. It's more about the content being rich and informative as well as being interesting. So if you're going to put this into your chapter, where do you put it? Well, in chapter 2, if you're going to do a mind map, I encourage you to consider putting it first in the chapter after the title searches section. Chapter 2 normally begins with an introduction. Then it has another section of including all the references, how many there were, where they were found, perhaps in ProQuest dissertations, EBSCOhost, what kind of books or libraries you used to get all your resources. And then after that, you would go into and present your first mind map, or the only one. And then it's a section, perhaps it's a dependent variable, and you introduce the dependent variable, and you have perhaps a paragraph or two at the most that includes information about the figure or the map. Now remember, as per the APA manual, the guidance prescribes that for any figure or table, it follows the paragraph where it's first mentioned. So if this is the case, in this section you might have that paragraph or two and you introduce the mind map. Then you offer the mind map as the figure. Don't forget to put the caption and the numbering correctly and in the right format as per the APA manual as well for that figure. And then you provide a narrative that describes the figure. Describe the figure much like you would in person if you were showing it to somebody. You start at the larger area and you build down. You introduce that map, then you present that map, and then you write to that map. Now if you're using more than one map, only write to one map at a time. Let's just say, for example, that you are going to do that quantitative study with that one dependent and 3 independent variables. Write to the dependent variable first with its own mind map. Then as you get to the first independent variable you're going to write about, do basically the same thing. Introduce the map in a narrative, present the map in a figure, then write to that map. Then go on to the next independent variable. If you're doing a qualitative study, perhaps you're going to do some sort of analysis after you do interviews of all the people in an emergency room after an emergency situation has happened. Or you're going to be doing interviews of a number of people in the K through 12 school, because you're going to be interviewing different nurses and doctors and staff people in the hospital. Those might be the 3 areas you write about the most. Or if you're in that school district, perhaps you're writing about students and teachers and administrative people. And those are the areas, if you will, or the broader areas that you're going to write to, and perhaps create more than one map for all of it, but one individual map for each individual group you're going to speak to. How to create a mind map. This is really how you put it together. Now some of you may have done this already in some of your work. Perhaps some of you are more creative and therefore you do this anyway. Some of you may have not been creative and you don't think you can be, but believe me, a little time with some markers and some paper, you can do a great job. First thing I recommend is just freehand. Draw it out first. Get a piece of paper, whatever it takes. For me, what I like to do, I have a bunch of dry erase markers that I picked up at Office Mac. They have them on sale. They got these thin, narrow ones, and they're in different colors. And what I do is I draw on my window in my living room. Actual windows in homes or in offices, you can use dry erase markers on, and they will come off easily with some water or some solvent to clean your windows with. And it doesn't matter whether it was up there for 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week, or months. It all comes off just as easily. So don't be afraid to do that. Make sure you have the dry erase marker, because otherwise, if it's a permanent marker, you may not like that very much. So what I do is freehand. I draw this out first. I put the ideas together on some sort of drawing. And I'll show you an example in a moment, basically, of how somebody else has done one and how I did one myself. Start with the headings and subheadings if you know them. As I mentioned, if you know you already have your dependent independent variables, you already know where to get started. The idea then being is once you put those all up on your drawing, is then you can start to show some other information that's related to it, and then start to show connections. Now it's certainly understandable, depending on where you're at in your work, you may not have your variables determined, or you may not have the different themes or insights about what you're going to use to research and study as in a qualitative design. So what you may want to do is use this opportunity to really get creative and just put up the things that come to you as far as interest. Let's just say, for example, you want to study productivity in your workplace. That could be the center, productivity. Now, what are the different things that relate to productivity? Well, it could be people, could be machines, it could be the different approaches on how people lead or manage. It could have something to do with HR group. There's many different things that you can consider, but you can start putting all these other items up on the board, and little by little, as you decide what path you want to go down, then you might look at it differently and start to see some organization come into place for you. For example, for me, I studied the cause and effect of a corporate fitness center. So I had corporate fitness center in the middle, and I started looking at what are the ramifications, perhaps causal factors or correlations about people using the fitness center. And that's the example I'm going to show you in a minute. Once you have a drawing and you feel like you're kind of at the end of it and you're not sure what else to put into it, share it. Share it with a few other people. Get some feedback. Oftentimes, it's the feedback that allows you to see something more and you can't see yourself. It's easy at first to do what we might call as data dump or get your initial ideas out. But getting feedback from others allows you then to have other people give you their insights based on their lived experiences, and they may have something of an understanding that you just don't have yet, or you thought you had it, but you just can't remember it. Feedback is a gift. I encourage you, if you have other colleagues or professional people around you who know about your topic and your ideas, get feedback from them. Oftentimes, one student tends to ask another student, and if a student's in a different degree program, you may not get the help you need. Go to other experts, just like you are an expert in your field. Go to other experts you know and ask them to give you feedback. Oftentimes they look at a picture and they say, oh, well, you missed this over here. What do you think about that? And that's that piece of the puzzle that you were missing. Also, in how to create the map, show connections, the directions wherever appropriate. As you'll see in the mind map I'm going to share in a moment, or any others that you find online, oftentimes between one circle and another is a line. And that line may have an arrow at one end or arrows at both ends. Depends on the flow of information. In the case of the corporate fitness center, if I was going to look at the cause and effect of the fitness center on employee morale, I would see that there's an arrow going out of the fitness center to employee morale. But then perhaps, maybe as employee morale improves, more people might use the fitness center. So maybe there's a correlation or even causality, depending on how you might look at this. And so therefore, I might have an arrowhead going into employee morale and performance, as well as going into the corporate fitness center. Oftentimes, this directions and this information that you're including as you put these arrows on here offers one the opportunity to perhaps see a connection they may not have seen otherwise, or allows one to see causal activity where perhaps it wasn't really readily known otherwise. How to create this mind map is to keep your mind moving from the obvious to the less obvious. And oftentimes this is why we get feedback from people to help us move from the obvious to the less obvious points of view. Now, oftentimes when I coach students on this, they're putting a mind map together, I'll often encourage them to find 20 different things for each area that they're talking about. 20 different, perhaps causal factors, maybe correlations, or just something that has some sort of relationship. It doesn't matter what they are. I tell them just come up with 20. Now what happens is usually the first 5 or 10 come out pretty easy. They're able to figure that out. Maybe number 11 to 15 or so is a bit of a struggle, but getting from 15 to 20 oftentimes is where the learning occurs, because these are the connections which not everybody sees all the time, because they're not focused on really moving from the obvious to less obvious. They're not really focused on going deep. And oftentimes this is where the major learning occurs. So if you're going to do a mind map, set yourself a number of items that you say you're going to work to create. You may get totally exhausted at 15 and not have any more information. Therefore, all the more reason to take your work and share it with other people and let them give you feedback, because they don't think like you do. They have different experiences. They may have a different approach. They may see things that are obvious to them. They're not obvious to you. So therefore, that feedback becomes very valuable, and you want to thank them for that feedback. So consider that mind map as always being designed from the obvious to the less obvious, or from the macro holistic view to the very narrow view. Something like, as you start to look at your problem statement, first you gave a general problem statement, what's the holistic view, then you got very narrow in scope and scoped it down to where that survey population is. Same kind of ideas can apply here. You can use the same sort of stepping or scoping concepts and practices, and this mind map allows you to do that much more for this chapter. Now, the examples I'm going to share are just two. There's many examples you can find on the internet. You can look at other dissertations that are in ProQuest dissertations and get some ideas if you're so inclined. But the most important thing is that a mind map is not that hard to do. And looking at online in any place, such as where I've taken this one from at wikipedia.org, and just type in mind map, you'll probably find this exact same item. And the reason I use this one is because it doesn't have copyright on it, and it's available for free use. What I see here is in the middle is mind map guidelines. Mind map guidelines provides information on how to create a mind map here. So the map is just not words of no relationship here. So this might actually even help you to learn how to create a mind map. So there should be some sort of clarity. There should be some sort of hierarchical or some order in it, and perhaps outlines that as you start to go through your work, you see different things emerging. Perhaps you also see that there's this information where it goes keywords below. If you're going to do your research in the internet, you're going to be using certain keywords. Those keywords may be actual individual circles on your mind map. Because if you start to look for employee performance in the internet and through the search engines in different literature supported vehicles, those are the words that you might want to have on your mind map. So if you get a chance to take a look at this more closely, please do, and or look at the picture that's available to you in the PowerPoint. Now this map, I just did a high-level map where I put Corporate Fitness Center in, because that's what I did my dissertation on. And I'll go, for example, and show you what we call the bigger circles in red, or the nodes. And you'll notice I use different colors here, and I did that purposely just so that perhaps you may see how it might work for you, or just to give you some perspective of what the items are. So Corporate Fitness Center was the dependent variable, and let's call employee productivity, reduced health care claims, less sick days, and perhaps other items as independent variables. First thing I did is I looked at employee productivity. I believe that if one uses a corporate fitness center and they're in better shape, they're healthier, they're going to be more productive. And so that's why I have that as an independent variable there. Now, I also believe that if employees are productive, they have higher levels of creativity, that they're willing to talk with other people more. They're using both left brain and right brain. If they're productive, they're getting things done, and they're being efficient and effective. Therefore, they're more than likely going to be having what I call increased communication with other people, because to be highly creative and be productive, they have to be communicating with other people, perhaps even building higher levels of trust and respect. If I was going to take the note here of increased communication, I would start to add items in there such as trust, respect, and then build upon those even more. I would look and say, in the case of employee productivity, that if employees are productive, they'll probably have higher levels of morale. We don't see a lot of productive people with low levels of morale. So there might be a correlation here between the two of them. That if you have high morale, you have high productivity. If you have high productivity, you may have then higher morale. Also, I believe that turnover is going to be less. Turnover is going to be less when you have employees who are productive. When the employee productivity is high, people enjoy their work. They want to stay there. They're not going to quit and leave. Now, I did the same kind of ideas, if you will, same lines of thinking for reduced health care costs, claims, and then I also add in the sick days. Now, I believe that if there is a reduction in health care claims because people are using the fitness center, the company is going to pay lower taxes. going to pay lower taxes because they don't have as many claims to pay upon. They also, if they're paying lower taxes, may increase employee morale because maybe there'll be more money for other things like bonuses, perhaps. Same thing that happens with health care claim costs being reduced. If that's the case, there's probably increased productivity of people. When you have that increased productivity, then of course you're going to have those less sick days. And you can take those less sick days and take it back up to higher levels of morale. Needless to say, when people are at work more because they're happy, they're productive, the morale is high, that also means that people are going to call in sick less. So you can see the relationships that I've put here. Now, this may not be quite as complex as it would be in a completed version. That's okay. My intent here is not to teach you how to complete a full map based on my dissertation or yours, but just get you the ideas of saying, how could you create this, and how could it add value to your work? Even if it doesn't get published in your dissertation, how is it going to help you? Now, for those who are uncertain about how to get started with writing your chapter 2, well, I think if you do this kind of mind map or concept map, that you can begin to write. Now, I can see with corporate fitness, as I start to write about that, I may look at different causes and effect or these relationships that are between these, and then it says an opportunity for me to say, okay, well, let me write about corporate fitness center first. Then let me have another major heading about employee productivity. And then let me have another subheading, if you will, on all the different items that deal with employee productivity. I could easily write 8 or 10 pages on employee productivity just based on the 4 nodes that I have there of higher levels of creativity, increased communication, turnover being less, and higher morale. That may be all I need to write about. So I may want to write 7 to 10 pages on employee productivity, and there I have it all figured out what I need to write. I can do the same thing with any of the other areas. Now, the more complete your map is, the easier it's going to be for you to create the headings and subheadings of your work. I encourage you, create a map like this. You might find it enjoyable, it might be fun for you, even if you believe you're not creative. You can do this. If you don't like the circles, make squares if you're more linear. There's many opportunities for you to make your work better and easier in the long run. Because if this provides you some organization, you may be able to take right from here and create the actual outline and write a great story for your chapter 2 that literally nobody else but you can design.